Hi, I'm Chris Howard, and welcome to Top of Mind. Like many of you, hopefully, I've had a really good break the last few weeks where I've unplugged from work and thought about different things and read some fiction and sat and thought about nothing sometimes, driving through northern Maine with no radio on, just watching the hills go by. And it struck me that it's so important to have a break for lots of different reasons. But when it comes to thinking about technology and trends in business and all of that stuff, sometimes these trends can be exhausting. Like many of you, probably, you've also been focused on artificial intelligence, generative AI, other topics like that for most of this year. What's starting to happen, though, now that is becoming clearer to me is that it's settling into a larger palette of capabilities, including AI capabilities and beyond. And the nature of these trends can be exhausting, kind of like a riptide, where it's all you're focused on and you're swimming with it, you're struggling with it perhaps, but what you actually need to do is sometimes figure out a way to escape it and gain a different perspective. That's really important. And so, like a riptide, if you're in it, you can't really see what's around you. But if you're looking at it from up on the dunes or up on the cliffs, you can actually see the patterns of water and the currents and so on. It gives you a very different perspective. So when we started talking about generative AI months ago, you'll remember that it didn't simply appear from nowhere. It was built on trends that had been in existence for as long as a decade. Things like natural language, things like conversational interfaces, machine learning and models, the emergence of new kinds of compute, and so on. And when ChatGPT came along, it was a catalyst that pulled all of those trends together and made them usable in a mass way. And that's often what happens with browsers, when browsers were introduced on the internet, for example, but also mobile phones, mobile devices. So these things come along once in a while, but they're built on things that came before. And so there is a need to kind of sometimes break away and take a larger perspective on things. And it sometimes results in behaviors that seem counterproductive or counterintuitive. So to escape a riptide, you swim parallel to the shore as opposed to trying to get to shore. In explorers in the early days of seafaring sometimes had to go away from the land in order to accomplish the route that they were looking for in order to find more favorable currents. So a break is a positive thing. It gives you perspective. My role at Gartner is to direct all of the research that we produce. And we're entering a really interesting time in the second half of the year where we're starting to get a lot of signals coming in through data that we're collecting, through trends that we're exploring. We have a number of surveys in field, for example, that are studying what do CEOs think, what do boards of directors think, and multiple of the other roles that we serve. And we're at the point where, as a team, we're looking at all of those signals together and looking for new patterns to emerge. And we're going to talk about that in just a couple of minutes. But there are a couple of other things that tend to occupy our minds. When I'm talking to clients, there are two things that come up very often. One is transformation, the other is innovation. And I know we've talked about this, for thousands and thousands of hours. But I thought it might be useful just to give you a bit of perspective in terms of how I think about it as I'm directing research. So transformation is a goal for so many people and companies. The truth is, it should be difficult and rare. Because to truly transform means that you are challenging your model, how you interact with the world. In terms of business, that may be your business model. So, what's my value proposition? Who are my customers or the receivers of that value? How do I create it? And so on. And to be honest, those things shouldn't change that often. And when they do change, it may be in reaction to a survival event where something has happened in the environment where you actually need to aggressively change. But it also happens as new technologies come along. Technologies on their own are not sufficient for transformation, but they enable transformation. As you think about the change of state from one state to another, that's a really dramatic change. Think about it in terms of nature. So a caterpillar becomes a moth or a butterfly. And they're very, very different, right? So the caterpillar moves really slowly. It kind of likes the dark. It likes moist environments and so on. It moves really slowly. Whereas when it becomes a butterfly or a moth, all of a sudden it doesn't live on the ground anymore. It lives in the air and it flies around and it moves really quickly. It is attracted to the light. That's a really significant change. Now, most of the businesses that you're in aren't going to experience that kind of change, but it does happen. Think about Nokia, for example. Nokia's history was in the rubber manufacturing of rubber for rubber boots and cables and those types of things, which led them into electronics, which then, of course, they're known for making mobile phones and devices. But that's the same kind of transition. It took a really long time to do that. What we're seeing, though, is as technology accelerates, transformation also accelerates. There used to be a 10-10 rule where you'd build a foundation for something for 10 years, and then it would take years for mass adoption. That's become much more like a 1-and-1, where it takes a year to build out a foundation and then it reaches mass adoption within a very quick period of time. So think about transformation in terms of fundamental changes to your business model. Are my customers changing? Is the way I make money changing? Is my value proposition different? Are my partners significantly different? Or are there some aspects of technology that enable a different kind of outcome? That's what transformation really is. Now, if you're stuck on thinking, well, all we do is optimize, that's still okay, right? So optimization paves the way for transformation because you're building up that foundation. Transformation means to make beyond. So transform is beyond and make. A related concept is innovation, which is to create new or to renew, these types of concepts here. Innovation, though, has misconceptions, but it also has the same kind of tyranny about it that other concepts do. Like, we have to innovate, we have to innovate. There's huge pressure to do this, but it's not necessarily well understood in terms of how the process of innovation works. By its nature, it's disruptive, but it usually is a recombination of existing things. Something that Stephen Johnson mentions in his book, Where Good Ideas Come From, and he's referencing Stuart Kaufman, this idea of the adjacent possible. So, what becomes possible because it's nearby? Part of that is as we build foundations, more things become possible. But the other act of innovation is there are available materials around us that we hadn't thought of combining in that way. We bring them together and we end up with something new. I was reading an interesting example about some of the first incubators for babies that were built and used in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, of course, it's a very difficult environment. Medical equipment is extremely expensive to repair, and you can't have catastrophic downtime. Now, if you're in the developed world, like in New York City or something like that, no problem. But if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, you actually need a very different design approach. So what they did is they used available materials and built the first incubators out of car parts, so that headlamps or headlights provided the warmth, fans from the cars provided the airflow, signals and alerts came from door chimes. Okay, so why did they do this? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of knowledge about how to repair automobiles in that part of the world. And so it made sense to create an incubator out of parts that people already knew how to fix. So that's what I mean about recombining and re-envisioning an outcome based on available materials, and it appears as an innovation. What we're finding is that the combination of the large language models with data that is proprietary to an organization and often goes back decades, that combination, which is called grounding, actually produces really great results that are different from what you were able to accomplish before. Your data, this new emerging thing, pulling those two things together to create results and new types of jobs. Now, right now, a lot of that is going towards productivity. But ultimately, what will happen is that as insight grows and the access to information grows, that becomes a potential revenue stream for companies that want to enable access to that information. That's an innovation, but it's also moving towards transformation. You're making money in a different way. The other thing about innovation is that it thrives through connection and doesn't thrive in isolation, which is creates some tension, right? Because in many ways, we're trying to innovate to be competitive. So at what point do we want to own that innovation? Well, there needs to be a period, like a petri dish ahead of that, where you're sharing ideas, you're working within an ecosystem, and then people are coming at the same problem from multiple ways, and then you can take it and convert it into a competitive offering. And this is very much the way that historic innovation has worked. Think about the Renaissance in Florence. It was that commons where people shared ideas and there was sort of this burst of energy of thinking. Same thing happens in cities like Boston for the medical field, or in Palo Alto, of course, Silicon Valley. What I wonder about, though, that we're looking at is virtual sharing and information where you're not co-located as effective. We need to find that out. So finally, on innovation, if you trace the history of innovation in different art forms or in architecture and things like that, this idea of patterns, then breaking those patterns and extending them is really common. So if you think about Gothic cathedrals, for example, they're a study in symmetry and proportion, much of which came from earlier architectures from Roman times and pre-Roman times. What happens is that secular architecture starts to mimic that. So the large palaces that were built, say, around Paris follow the same kind of symmetrical design, but it's for a very secular purpose. Then you move way forward to Frank Lloyd Wright. He's still using structures like that, but he's extending them and repeating them and elongating them and fracturing them and so on. But you can still trace the lineage. But you don't get to Frank Lloyd Wright without Gothic cathedrals. There's a line that you can draw there. Same thing happens in visual art. You can find patterns that sit behind Renaissance paintings that get really super exposed in abstract art, perhaps. But then somebody comes along like Andrew Wyeth, and what Wyeth does is he will paint the same scene but move the objects around. So he's constantly shifting perspective and trying to gain new stories out of moving things around. We have the same opportunities in business to recombine the materials that we have without losing the fundamental patterns. But this is hard. And why is it hard? This kind of innovation is hard because the environment needs to support it. It's what's called formative context, is the way the business operates. So if you have a really successful business, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's where innovation just hits a wall. But you still need to be thinking innovatively because incumbency is no guarantee. So back to where I started. So Chief of Research at Gartner, I'm responsible for directing the research that we're going to do. This is a very interesting time of year because we have so many signals coming in and we're studying trends. We're preparing, for example, for our IT Symposium event where I'll be talking about strategic technology trends and other things. But we are doing this in many different ways. From a top level, we have a publication called Tapestry, which looks at multiple sort of very large global trends and what happens if they combine. We do things like the Board of Directors survey and CEO survey, where we're watching trends over time and senior leadership. We're doing things like the top strategic technology trends that you'll see more of as we hit October timeframe. But what I'm doing with my leadership team is having them bring ideas to the table and just put everything out and say, what do we have? What are the roles that we serve caring about? What is happening in different industries? What are the business trends? What are the global trends? And what do those mean for advice that we should be giving? And hopefully we don't have another year where it's really dominated by one thing, so Gen AI. Well, what I've asked my team to do is to say, are there any other things that are converging like that? Are there patterns that we've seen maturing over the last 5, 6, 7 years that are ready for some kind of a catalyst to happen? It might be a technology catalyst. It could be a management catalyst. It could be a leadership catalyst, a human catalyst. All of those things are fair game. And so what we'll do in the upcoming episodes here is sort of take some of those apart and examine individual trends and the combinations of trends that are both innovative and transformative. Thanks for joining me. I'm Chris Howard. This has been Top of Mind.